March 1942. Auschwitz II Birkenau, German-occupied Poland. ****. The train doors opened to a world stripped of mercy. Salomon Hoffman stepped onto the platform, his legs unsteady after 3 days pressed against strangers in darkness. The air tasted of coal smoke and something else, something that made his throat close. Around him, hundreds of prisoners shuffled forward under the glare of searchlights that carved the night into fragments of shadow and brutal clarity. He was 43 years old, though the journey had aged him. Before the war, he had owned a modest barbershop on Casimir Street in Kraków. 3 chairs, mirrors with beveled edges, the smell of bay rum and talcum powder. Customers would lean back while he worked, discussing politics or football, their voices echoing off tile walls. That world felt impossibly distant now, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. The selection happened quickly. SS officers in long coats moved down the line, pointing left or right with casual indifference. Hoffman watched families torn apart without ceremony, children pulled from mothers, old men directed toward trucks that rumbled away into darkness. When the officer reached him, Hoffman stood straight, forcing his exhausted body into a posture that suggested usefulness. The officer's eyes swept over him once, then gestured to the right. He had passed the first test. For now. The barracks smelled of unwashed bodies, sickness and despair. Men lay on wooden bunks stacked 3 high, their faces hollow in the dim light. Hoffman found a space on the middle tier, the wood cold and splintered against his back. Around him, prisoners whispered in a dozen languages, their voices creating a low murmur that never quite stopped, even when exhaustion finally pulled him toward sleep. In those first days, Hoffman learned the rhythm of the camp. Morning roll call in the freezing darkness, hours standing while guards counted and recounted, sometimes punishing the entire assembly for a single prisoner's mistake. Work assignments that ground men down until they were barely recognizable as human. The constant hunger that made his stomach feel like it was consuming itself from the inside. He was assigned to a construction detail, hauling stones from one pile to another in labor that served no purpose beyond breaking spirits. His hands, once steady enough to trim hair with precision, blistered and bled. At night, he would examine them in the faint light, watching the calluses form over wounds, wondering how long it would be before they were too damaged to remember their former skill. But Hoffman observed everything. He noticed the hierarchy among prisoners, the kapos who enforced order in exchange for extra rations, the small trades that happened in shadows, the ways men found to preserve fragments of dignity in a place designed to destroy it. He watched the guards, learning which ones would beat prisoners for sport and which ones simply wanted the day to end without incident. Most of all, he noticed the camp barbers. They worked in a building near the entrance, visible through windows as prisoners filed past. Their scissors moved through hair with mechanical efficiency, shearing new arrivals, maintaining the appearance of order that the SS demanded. The barbers wore slightly cleaner striped uniforms. They moved with less obvious exhaustion. They ate a little better, though only a little. And they survived. 3 weeks after his arrival, Hoffman watched a camp barber collapse during roll call. The man simply folded forward and did not get up. Guards dragged his body away without comment. That afternoon, a capo walked through the barracks calling for anyone with barbering experience. The request was repeated in Polish, German, Yiddish, Russian. Hoffman's hands trembled as he raised one arm. The capo looked him over with calculating eyes, then nodded. Follow. He did not know yet what he was stepping into. He knew only that the alternative was the stone pile, the gradual erosion of strength, the inevitable moment when his body would give out just as that other barbers had. So he followed the capo across the muddy ground toward the low building where prisoners were transformed into numbers, where hair fell in piles and mirrors showed faces that no longer recognized themselves. The capo pushed him through the door. Inside, 4 barbers worked in silence, their movements quick and practiced. An SS guard stood near the wall, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. The smell of disinfectant cut through the other odors of the camp, sharp and chemical. The senior barber, a Frenchman named Henri, looked up when Hoffman entered. His face was gaunt, but his eyes held something different from the hollow resignation Hoffman had seen in most prisoners. Intelligence, perhaps. Or calculation. Henri gestured to an empty chair, then to a prisoner who stood waiting, freshly arrived and still uncertain about what was happening to him. Hoffman picked up the scissors. They felt strange in his damaged hands, heavier than he remembered. But as he began to cut, muscle memory took over. The movements returned. He trimmed the prisoner's hair to the regulation length, working quickly while trying not to think about the significance of what he was doing, how this small act was part of a vast machinery of dehumanization. When he finished, Henri examined the work with a critical eye. He said nothing but gave a slight nod. Hoffman had passed the second test. That night, back in the barracks, other prisoners looked at him differently. Some with envy, understanding that he had claimed a position that might keep him alive. Others with something closer to contempt, seeing in his new role a form of collaboration. Hoffman lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden slats above him, and wondered which judgment was more accurate. He did not yet understand that the scissors he now carried would become more than instruments of survival. He could not yet see how this position would offer him possibilities that no stone pile ever would, small opportunities to act in ways that might matter. That understanding would come later, slowly, as he learned to navigate the impossible moral landscape he now inhabited. For now, he was simply a barber again, in the most terrible place imaginable, trying to live another day. This documentary is based on composite accounts of prisoner experiences in Nazi concentration camps, particularly Auschwitz-Birkenau. While Salomon Hoffman is a representative character, the networks of quiet resistance described here did exist. Prisoners in various roles, barbers, doctors, clerks, workers in the Canada warehouses, found ways to help others within the brutal constraints of the camp system. The methods of resistance depicted: information sharing, smuggling small items, providing medicine, offering human connection, are documented in survivor testimonies and historical research. The risks were exactly as described. Discovery meant torture and execution, not only for the individual but often for many others. This story honors all prisoners who resisted in small ways, whose names have been forgotten but whose actions saved lives and preserved humanity in places designed to eliminate both. They fought with what they had: scissors, information, gentle words, small acts of kindness. And their fight mattered more than any simple accounting can express. Their legacy is the reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when grand resistance seems impossible, small acts of courage and compassion remain possible. And sometimes those small acts are enough to make the difference between despair and hope, between death and survival, between surrendering to evil and maintaining one's humanity despite it. This is their story. May it be remembered. The barbershop operated with ruthless efficiency. New arrivals filed through in groups of 20, stripped of belongings and clothing, their heads shaved in less than 2 minutes per person. The hair fell into bins that were emptied twice daily, collected for purposes Hoffman tried not to think about. By the end of each day, his arms ached from the repetitive motion, and the floor was covered in hair of every color, a carpet of stripped identity. Henri ran the shop with the discipline of a military operation. He assigned prisoners to specific tasks. Some cut hair, others swept, one maintained the tools, another managed the flow of new arrivals. The system worked because it had to. Failure meant replacement, and replacement meant death. During quiet moments, Henri taught Hoffman the unspoken rules. Never look an SS guard directly in the eye unless addressed. Never hesitate when given an order. Never show emotion when cutting the hair of children, who sometimes cried, not understanding why this was happening. The work required the barbers to become automatons, performing their task without thought or feeling. But Henri also taught Hoffman other things, lessons delivered in whispers during the few minutes when guards stepped outside to smoke. "You see everything from this chair," Henri said one afternoon, his voice barely audible over the sound of scissors. "Prisoners tell you things. They forget you're listening, or they need to tell someone, anyone. You hear about who's sick, who's planning something, who's breaking." Hoffman listened, his hands moving mechanically through another prisoner's hair. "The guards talk too," Henri continued. "They think we're furniture. They discuss things right in front of us. Transfers, selections, rule changes. Information is valuable here. It can be the difference between surviving and not." Over the following weeks, Hoffman began to understand what Henri meant. Prisoners would sit in the chair and some would whisper fears or questions. A man worried about his brother in another barracks. A woman asking if Hoffman had seen her daughter. Fragments of humanity asserting themselves even in this place designed to crush such impulses. The guards were different. They spoke openly about camp operations, complaining about increased quotas, discussing transport schedules, speculating about the war's progress. They treated the barbers as part of the furniture, present but not truly there. Hoffman learned to listen without appearing to listen, to remember without reacting. He discovered that information moved through the camp in invisible currents. Knowledge about which work details were less brutal, which guards could be bribed, when selections might occur. These whispers could save lives. And the barbershop, because it processed every new arrival and because guards spoke freely in its presence, sat at the center of these currents. Henri had built something beyond a barbershop. He had created an intelligence network, subtle and careful, passing information to prisoners who could use it. A warning about an upcoming inspection might allow sick prisoners to hide. News about a transport arriving could help people locate family members. Small pieces of information, carefully distributed, that gave prisoners fractional advantages in a system designed to give them none. Hoffman watched Henri work this network with quiet admiration. The Frenchman never took unnecessary risks, never made himself obvious. He simply listened, remembered, and when opportunities arose, he would mention something to a prisoner in passing, a casual comment that seemed meaningless but could be life-saving to someone who understood its significance. One evening, after the last prisoner had been processed and the guards had left, Henri stood beside Hoffman as they cleaned their stations. The shop was quiet except for the sound of sweeping, the whisper of bristles against floorboards. "There's something else," Henri said, his voice low. Something more important than information. Hoffman paused, looking at the Frenchman. Henri picked up a pair of scissors, turning them in the dim light. We cut hair, yes. But we also touch people. We're one of the few prisoners who do. A hand on the shoulder to steady them. Fingers adjusting their head position. Small contacts that remind them they're still human, still physical beings deserving of care, even if that care is just a careful haircut. He set the scissors down carefully. Don't underestimate that, Henri said. Sometimes the smallest gesture of gentleness is an act of resistance. It won't overthrow anything. But it reminds people that humanity survives even here. Hoffman thought about this as he finished cleaning his station. He had been focused on survival, on performing his role adequately enough to avoid punishment. He had not considered that the role itself might offer opportunities for something more than mere survival. That night, lying on his bunk, Hoffman replayed Henri's words. The smallest gesture of gentleness. In a place built on systematic cruelty, even minor acts of human connection became significant. A steadying hand. A word of quiet encouragement. The simple act of treating someone gently when gentleness was forbidden. The next morning, as Hoffman cut the hair of an elderly man who trembled in the chair, he placed his hand on the man's shoulder with deliberate care. Just a light touch, steadying him. The man looked up briefly and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the acknowledgement that this moment was different from the brutal ones that surrounded it. It was such a small thing. But Henri was right. In this place, small things could matter immensely. Hoffman began to pay attention differently. He watched how Henri interacted with prisoners, the careful way he positioned their heads, the occasional words spoken gently rather than barked. These were acts of preservation, maintaining some fragment of dignity in people who were being systematically stripped of it. And Hoffman began to understand that he had been given more than a survival position. He had been given a role that, if he was careful and clever, might allow him to push back against the machine that surrounded them. Not in dramatic ways, those would only get him killed. But in small, quiet ways that accumulated over time, building tiny pockets of resistance that the guards couldn't quite identify or stamp out. He was still a prisoner, still trapped, still subject to the same brutal rules as everyone else. But he was no longer just hauling stones from one pile to another. He was part of something more complex, more human, more dangerous. He was learning to be a hero in a place where heroism was impossible. And that education, taught in whispers and demonstrated through small gestures, would change everything. Winter came to Birkenau with particular cruelty. The barracks offered little protection from the cold, and prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of fabric they could find, huddling together for warmth. Hoffman's hands grew stiff, making it harder to work the scissors with his former precision. He would blow on his fingers between prisoners, trying to keep enough flexibility to continue cutting. But the cold also brought a kind of clarity. Survival became more urgent, more immediate. Prisoners who might have survived the summer began to fail in December. The morning roll calls grew longer as guards counted and recounted, sometimes discovering bodies that had frozen during the night. The pile of unclaimed shoes near the entrance grew higher. In the barbershop, Henri moved with increased urgency. He had been distributing information carefully for months, but now his network expanded in subtle ways. Hoffman began to understand its structure, not a formal organization which would have been quickly detected and destroyed, but a loose web of prisoners who helped each other in small ways. A capo who could be trusted to look away at crucial moments. A clerk in the camp administration who had access to transport lists. A doctor in the infirmary who might spare an extra moment with a patient. An electrician who worked throughout the camp and heard things. These people never met together, never acknowledged any coordination. But information and small favors flowed between them through careful intermediaries, and Henri sat at the center, connecting pieces while maintaining complete deniability. Hoffman's role became clearer. As a barber, he processed hundreds of prisoners each week. He saw everyone who arrived, heard fragments of their stories, learned who they were looking for. He could pass information to Henri, who could then route it to wherever it might help. A mother arrived asking about her daughter. Hoffman remembered cutting the daughter's hair 2 weeks earlier, remembered the barracks number she'd mentioned. He told Henri. Henri told someone else. A few days later, during a brief moment when guards changed shifts, mother and daughter were reunited for 30 seconds in a corridor. Just long enough to exchange words, to confirm the other was alive. Small victories. But victories nonetheless. Hoffman also began to recognize certain prisoners who needed help beyond information. A young man who arrived badly beaten, his face swollen. Hoffman took extra time with his haircut, using those minutes to let the man rest in the chair, to speak quietly about which work details were less brutal, which guards to avoid. The young man nodded, his eyes grateful for this unexpected kindness. An older woman who seemed disoriented, confused by the chaos around her. Hoffman cut her hair gently, his hand steady on her shoulder, telling her simple instructions about how to survive the next few hours. Just focus on the next thing, he said. Then the thing after that. She listened, and something in her eyes sharpened. When she left, she moved with more purpose. These moments accumulated. Hoffman discovered that the barbershop's constant flow of prisoners created opportunities. A man might mention being a mechanic before the war. Hoffman would remember. Later, when someone whispered that the camp needed mechanics for a new work detail, Hoffman could mention the man's name to Henri, who could ensure the information reached the right person. The mechanic would be reassigned to a position that was marginally better than wherever he'd been, and his chances of survival improved slightly. None of this was organized in any formal sense. There were no meetings, no plans, no records. Everything existed in whispers and careful observations, in the accumulation of small actions that created tiny advantages in a system designed to offer none. But Hoffman also learned the dangers. One morning, he arrived at the barbershop to find Henri absent. The other barbers worked in unusual silence, their faces carefully blank. An SS guard stood watch, his eyes suspicious. No one explained what had happened, but the absence spoke clearly enough. 3 days later, Henri returned. He had been questioned about a prisoner who had escaped from a work detail. Someone had mentioned seeing Henri speak to the man the day before. The interrogation had been brutal, but Henri had maintained his innocence convincingly. He knew nothing about escape plans. He simply cut hair. The guard eventually believed him, or at least couldn't prove otherwise. But Henri returned with fresh bruises and a new caution in his movements. That evening, as they cleaned the shop, he spoke to Hoffman in a voice even quieter than usual. "Never assume you're safe," Henri said. "Never assume they're not watching. The moment you become comfortable is the moment you make mistakes." Hoffman nodded, understanding that he had just witnessed the precarious nature of what they were doing. Helped too obviously, and you drew attention. But Henri had not stopped. He simply became more careful. Over the following months, Hoffman refined his own methods. He learned to memorize faces and names quickly, to make connections between prisoners without seeming to try. He developed a system of subtle questions, asking about skills, about family, about where people were from, that seemed like idle conversation but gathered information that might later prove valuable. He also learned to identify prisoners who could be trusted. Not everyone was safe to help. Some prisoners informed on others, hoping to gain favor with guards. Others simply couldn't handle the psychological weight of resistance, even quiet resistance. Hoffman became skilled at reading people quickly, deciding in seconds whether someone could be trusted with information or whether they needed to be handled more carefully. The barbershop's other workers also played roles. One barber, a Polish man named Stefan, had particularly good hearing and could catch conversations between guards that others missed. Another, a young Czech named Tomas, had a photographic memory for faces and could track which prisoners were in which barracks. They didn't discuss their coordination explicitly, but each contributed to the collective knowledge that flowed through their small space. By spring, Hoffman understood that he was part of something significant, though also something impossibly fragile. The network Henri had built saved lives, not in dramatic ways, but through accumulated small advantages that gave prisoners slightly better chances. Information about upcoming selections let people hide or position themselves more favorably. Knowledge about which guards were more lenient helped prisoners avoid the worst brutality. Small acts of connection reminded people that humanity survived. But the price of discovery was death, not just for the person caught but often for many others. The SS would make examples, would tear apart any suspected resistance with terrifying efficiency. So everything had to remain invisible, deniable, a ghost network that functioned through whispers and coincidences that could never be proven deliberate. Hoffman cut hair. That was his job. That was all anyone could prove. But in those moments when his hands steadied a prisoner's head, when he whispered information disguised as casual comment, when he connected people who needed connecting, in those moments he was doing something more. He was fighting back with scissors and whispers, waging a war so quiet that most people never knew it was happening. And every morning he woke wondering if today would be the day someone noticed, the day the machinery turned its attention toward him and crushed what he was trying to preserve. But he kept working. Because the alternative, accepting the role of mere collaborator, cutting hair without caring, becoming another mechanism in the machine, was a kind of death he couldn't accept. So he chose the dangerous path. He chose to care. And that choice, multiplied across hundreds of small actions, began to matter in ways he was only starting to understand. April 1943 brought changes to the camp. Transports arrived with increased frequency, the train platforms crowded with confused prisoners being processed through the selection. The camp's population swelled, and with it, the workload in the barbershop intensified. Hoffman's arms ached constantly now, and his hands had developed permanent calluses from gripping scissors for 12 hours each day. But the increased activity also brought increased opportunity. With more prisoners flowing through the camp, more information could be gathered and distributed. Henri expanded the network carefully, identifying new people who might serve as nodes in the invisible web they were building. One of these was a woman named Esther. She worked in Canada, the section of the camp where belongings confiscated from arriving prisoners were sorted and processed. It was called Canada because prisoners imagined that distant, wealthy country when they saw the piles of clothes, shoes, jewelry and personal items stacked in vast warehouses. Esther had access to things most prisoners never saw: medicine hidden in coat linings, food smuggled in suitcases, photographs and letters that families had brought, hoping to keep such treasures safe. Henri connected Hoffman to Esther through careful intermediaries. They never met directly, but information and small items began to flow between them. A prisoner in the barbershop might mention desperately needing something: aspirin for a sick friend, a warmer jacket for someone failing in the cold. Hoffman would pass the request to Henri. Henri would route it through 2 other prisoners. Eventually, if possible, Esther would locate the item among the sorted belongings and find a way to smuggle it out of Canada. It was impossibly risky. Discovery meant immediate execution. But Esther, like Henri, like Hoffman, had decided that doing nothing was worse than dying. So she took the risks, and sometimes, not often but sometimes, a sick prisoner received medicine that kept them alive another week. A freezing prisoner received a hidden sweater that made the difference between dying and surviving. These were not dramatic rescues. No one escaped through tunnels or fought guards. But the network's quiet actions accumulated into something significant. A prisoner who survived because of smuggled medicine might later help others. A person saved from freezing might share hidden food. Small acts rippled outward in ways that couldn't always be predicted but could be felt throughout the camp's invisible resistance. Hoffman also began to notice other networks operating independently. The camp held thousands of prisoners, and some had organized their own systems of mutual aid and resistance. He would catch glimpses: a whispered conversation between prisoners who seemed to be coordinating something, a doctor who treated patients with supplies that shouldn't exist, a capo who looked away at crucial moments for reasons that seemed deliberate. Henri explained one night that these separate networks rarely connected directly. Too dangerous. If one was discovered and its members tortured, they couldn't betray what they didn't know. But the networks existed in a kind of parallel structure, each working independently toward similar goals, occasionally intersecting in ways that benefited everyone. Hoffman's role continued to evolve. He had become skilled at extracting information during the brief minutes he spent with each prisoner. A casual question about their hometown might reveal they had skills that could be valuable. A comment about their journey might provide intelligence about conditions in other camps or ghettos. This information, passed carefully through the network, helped build a picture of the broader war that few prisoners understood. And sometimes, the information moved in the other direction. Henri received news from outside: fragments of reports about Allied advances, rumors about resistance movements, whispers about what was really happening in the camp's gas chambers. This information was distributed carefully to prisoners who could handle it, who wouldn't break under the psychological weight of the truth. Hoffman learned to gauge who needed hope and who needed knowledge. Some prisoners survived by maintaining illusions, believing they would be released once the war ended, convincing themselves that the smoke from the crematoria was just factory work. For these people, harsh truths would shatter their fragile defenses. But others were sustained by knowledge, by understanding what they faced, by maintaining clarity in a place designed to confuse and disorient. The barbershop became, in Hoffman's mind, something like a confessional. People sat in his chair and sometimes spoke truths they couldn't say anywhere else. A man who had abandoned his family to save himself. A woman who had betrayed a friend to gain better rations. People carried these secrets like stones, and sometimes, in the intimacy of the haircut, they needed to set them down, if only for a moment. Hoffman listened without judgment. He offered no absolution. He had no authority to forgive. But he provided something perhaps more valuable. He bore witness. He acknowledged their pain, their guilt, their humanity. In a place that reduced people to numbers, being seen as human even briefly mattered profoundly. One afternoon in late spring, a young man sat in Hoffman's chair. He was perhaps 20, though the camp had aged him beyond his years. As Hoffman worked, the young man spoke softly about his mother, who had been selected immediately upon arrival. He described the moment of separation, how she had squeezed his hand one final time before being directed toward the trucks. "I should have gone with her," the young man said, his voice breaking. "I should have insisted." Hoffman paused, his scissors still. He placed his hand on the young man's shoulder, feeling him shake with suppressed grief. "You survived," Hoffman said quietly. "That's what she would have wanted. Your survival is how you honor her." It was a small comfort, probably insufficient. But the young man nodded, and when he left the chair, he seemed marginally more solid, as if Hoffman's words had given him something to hold on to. These moments of connection became the hidden heart of Hoffman's work. The information he gathered, the small favors he helped coordinate, the medicine and food that flowed through the network. These were important. But equally important was this other work, this quiet ministry of bearing witness, offering small comforts, reminding people that they were still human and still capable of human connection. By summer, Hoffman had been working in the barbershop for over a year. He had survived longer than most prisoners, and he understood why. His position gave him marginally better food, slightly less brutal physical labor, and access to a network that provided small protections. But he also understood that his survival had meaning beyond mere self-preservation. He was part of something larger than himself. The network of quiet resistance, the small acts of defiance, the preservation of humanity in a place designed to destroy it, these efforts would not stop the war or liberate the camp. But they mattered to the individuals who benefited from them. And perhaps Hoffman thought that was enough. Perhaps saving one person at a time, helping where you could, resisting in small ways when large resistance was impossible, perhaps that was the only reasonable response to overwhelming evil. He cut hair. He listened. He connected people. He bore witness. And in doing so he fought back the only way available to him. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real and it made a difference, and that would have to be enough. August 1943. The summer heat made the barbershop almost unbearable. The small building had no ventilation beyond a single window that barely opened, and with 20 prisoners sometimes waiting outside for haircuts, the air became thick and stifling. Hoffman's striped uniform stuck to his back with sweat, and he had to pause frequently to wipe his forehead before moisture dripped into his eyes. But the heat was the least of his concerns. A new transport had arrived from the Kraków ghetto, and among the prisoners being processed was a man Hoffman recognized immediately. Dr. Leszek Kowalski. They had known each other before the war, not well but enough that recognition was mutual and instant. Kowalski sat in Hoffman's chair, his face carefully blank. The doctor understood the danger of showing recognition in a place where every connection might be exploited. Hoffman kept his expression neutral as well, his hands steady as he began cutting Kowalski's hair. But as he worked, Hoffman positioned his body to block the guard's view and leaned close to Kowalski's ear. "Do you have anything?" Hoffman whispered, so quietly the words were almost imagination rather than sound. Kowalski's eyes flickered once. "Yes." During the chaos of arrival, some prisoners managed to hide small items on their bodies: documents, medicines, messages. These items represented enormous risk but also potential value. Hoffman had learned to watch for certain signs: a stiffness in how someone moved, a protective gesture toward a specific pocket, the slight panic in eyes that suggested they carried contraband. When Hoffman finished the haircut, he placed his hand on Kowalski's shoulder and squeezed twice. A signal. Kowalski gave the barest nod. That night Hoffman couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring into darkness, knowing that somewhere in the vast camp, Kowalski was carrying something dangerous. The question was how to retrieve it without both of them being discovered and killed. The network had protocols for such situations, developed through trial and error and maintained through careful oral tradition. But each retrieval was unique, requiring adaptation to specific circumstances. Hoffman spent the night running through possibilities, discarding options that seemed too risky, trying to identify an approach that might work. 2 days later he finally saw his opportunity. The SS had ordered a complete haircut rotation for prisoners in Kowalski's barracks, a routine sanitation measure that happened periodically. Kowalski would be brought to the barbershop along with dozens of other prisoners. In that controlled chaos, Hoffman might be able to facilitate a transfer. He prepared carefully. First he spoke with Stefan, the barber with exceptional hearing. Stefan confirmed that no guards had mentioned any special attention to Kowalski. He was just another prisoner, unremarkable in the system's eyes. That was good. It meant they hadn't identified him as significant. Next, Hoffman arranged the barbershop's layout slightly differently. He positioned his chair closer to a corner, creating a small blind spot from the guard's usual position. The change was subtle enough that it wouldn't draw attention, but it gave him fractionally more privacy. When the prisoners from Kowalski's barracks arrived, Hoffman watched as they filed in. Kowalski was near the middle of the group, his face showing nothing. The guard on duty that day was Schaefer, a young SS man who spent most of his time reading magazines rather than watching the prisoners closely. Not ideal but workable. Hoffman cut hair steadily, working through the line. When Kowalski's turn came, the doctor sat in the chair without acknowledgement. Hoffman began cutting, his movements routine and mechanical. But as he worked around to Kowalski's left side, positioning himself to block Schaefer's view, he whispered again. "Where?" "Left boot. Inner lining." Hoffman continued cutting, his mind racing. Retrieving something from a boot would be nearly impossible without being obvious. He would need a distraction, something that drew attention away for crucial seconds. As if summoned by thought, Stefan suddenly knocked over a bin of hair clippings. The crash was loud in the quiet room and Schaefer looked up from his magazine, annoyed. Stefan apologized profusely in broken German, scrambling to clean up the mess. In those seconds while Schaefer's attention was diverted, Hoffman crouched beside Kowalski's chair, ostensibly to adjust the man's foot position. His fingers found the boot, worked into the inner lining and extracted a small package wrapped in oilcloth. The entire movement took perhaps 3 seconds. He palmed the package, standing smoothly, resuming his cutting. When he finished Kowalski's haircut, the package was hidden inside his own boot. They had done it. But now Hoffman carried something that could get him executed if discovered. He didn't even know what it was. documents, medicine, information. It didn't matter. He simply needed to transfer it to Henri, who would know what to do with it. The day stretched endlessly. Hoffman cut hair mechanically, hyper-aware of the package pressed against his ankle. Every time Schaefer looked in his direction, he was certain the guard somehow knew, could somehow see through clothing and leather to the hidden contraband. When the day finally ended and the last prisoners had been processed, Hoffman cleaned his station with deliberate slowness. The other barbers gradually left. Henri remained, as he often did, performing administrative tasks that kept him in the shop after hours. When they were finally alone, Hoffman approached Henri and handed him the package without words. Henri took it, his face betraying no surprise, and tucked it into his own clothing. Then he looked at Hoffman with an expression that might have been approval or might have been concern. "Do you know what you're carrying?" Henri asked. "No. Typhus vaccine. 5 doses. And a list of names, people in the Krakow underground who are still operating." Hoffman felt something cold settle in his stomach. Typhus vaccine could save lives, but possession of it raised questions about where it came from, which could unravel security networks. And names of resistance members outside the camp? That information was explosive. If the SS discovered it, they would torture everyone connected to it until the entire network, inside and outside the camp, was destroyed. "The vaccine will go to the infirmary," Henri said. "One of the doctors there can use it for prisoners who might otherwise die. The list." He paused. "The list needs to reach someone who can get it out of the camp. Someone in the underground. How? I don't know yet. But carrying it is now more dangerous than anything we've done before. If you want to step back from this, I would understand." Hoffman thought about Kowalski, who had risked everything to carry this package into the camp. He thought about the prisoners who might survive typhus because of the vaccine. He thought about the resistance members whose identities were now in Henri's possession, people fighting to bring down the system that had built places like this. "No," Hoffman said. "I don't want to step back." Henri nodded slowly. "Then we move forward. But carefully. One mistake now could destroy everything." Over the following week, Henri worked with painful slowness to distribute the vaccine. One dose went to a doctor who treated prisoners discreetly, given to a young woman showing early symptoms who might be saved if treated quickly. Another dose went to a prisoner who worked in the camp's main administrative building, someone whose survival was crucial to maintaining information flow about transport schedules and selections. The other 3 doses were held in reserve, hidden in a place Hoffman didn't ask about. Better not to know. If he was captured and tortured, he couldn't reveal what he didn't understand. The list of names proved more complicated. Henri spent days trying to identify a secure channel for getting information out of the camp. Such channels existed: prisoners assigned to work details outside the wire, civilians who worked in the camp in various capacities, even some guards who could be bribed or blackmailed. But using any of them meant enormous risk. Hoffman continued his normal work, cutting hair, gathering information, making connections. But now every action felt weighted with additional danger. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just helping prisoners survive within the camp. He was now actively working against the SS, carrying information that threatened their security. The weight of this pressed on him constantly. At night, lying on his bunk, he would think about what would happen if they were discovered. The interrogation. The torture. The public execution, probably by hanging, designed to terrorize other prisoners into submission. He knew what he risked. But he also knew he couldn't stop. Because somewhere in Krakow, resistance members were still fighting. And if the information he carried could help them survive, could help them continue their work, then the risk was justified. Not safe. Not smart perhaps. But justified. 2 weeks after receiving the package, Henri told Hoffman that the list had been successfully transferred to someone outside the camp. How exactly, Hoffman never learned. Henri simply said it was done, and Hoffman chose to believe him. That night, Hoffman slept better than he had in weeks. They had done something significant. Not just helping prisoners survive day to day, but actively contributing to larger resistance efforts. It was a small victory in a war they couldn't win, but it was still a victory. And sometimes, Hoffman thought, small victories were all you could achieve. But you achieved them anyway because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant letting the machine win completely. So you kept fighting, kept resisting, kept holding on to humanity even when humanity seemed like an absurd luxury. You cut hair. You passed information. You risked everything. And you hoped that somewhere, somehow, it mattered. November 1943. The first snow fell early that year, dusting the camp in white that quickly turned gray under the ash that constantly drifted from the crematoria. Hoffman had now been in Birkenau for over 18 months, far longer than most prisoners survived. He had become efficient at his work, his hands moving through the cutting motions with practiced ease despite chronic pain in his joints and the constant hunger that never fully abated. The network had expanded carefully throughout the year. More prisoners now participated in the quiet resistance. Passing information, smuggling small items, helping others in ways that seemed coincidental but were actually coordinated. No one spoke of it explicitly. There were no meetings, no formal structure. But the web existed, and it functioned, and it saved lives in increments too small to measure but too significant to dismiss. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early November, everything began to unravel. Hoffman arrived at the barbershop to find it surrounded by SS guards. His first instinct was to run, but that would only confirm guilt. So he walked forward steadily, his face carefully neutral, while his heart hammered against his ribs. The senior guard, an Oberscharfer named Muller who Hoffman had seen but never directly interacted with, stood near the entrance. His expression was cold, assessing. He gestured for Hoffman to enter. Inside, the shop had been torn apart. Chairs overturned, drawers emptied, supplies scattered across the floor. And in the center of the chaos stood Henri, his face swollen and bloodied. They had been beating him. Two other barbers knelt nearby, their hands bound behind their backs. Muller spoke in German that Hoffman understood from his years in Krakow. We received information about smuggling operations. Medicine. Documents. Items stolen from the Canada warehouses. The investigation has been ongoing for 3 weeks. Hoffman's mind raced. 3 weeks. Long enough for the SS to have been watching, documenting, building a case. But if they had concrete evidence of specific actions, they would have arrested everyone immediately. The torn-apart shop suggested they were still searching, still trying to establish proof. Someone informed on you, Muller continued, walking slowly around the room. Not about specific actions but about suspicious behavior. Conversations that seemed coordinated. Prisoners receiving information they shouldn't have. Small discrepancies in supply inventories. He stopped in front of Henri. This one has been questioned extensively. He maintains he knows nothing about any smuggling or resistance activities. He simply cuts hair. Muller's tone suggested he didn't believe Henri's denials, but also suggested he couldn't prove otherwise. The network's careful structure was protecting them. No written records, no formal organization, nothing concrete that could be presented as evidence. So now we expand the investigation, Muller said, turning to look at Hoffman. You will also be questioned. Along with every prisoner who has worked in this barbershop, everyone who has been seen speaking with these men, everyone connected in any way to this operation. Hoffman understood the strategy. Cast a wide net. Question hundreds of prisoners. Apply enough pressure until someone broke and provided testimony that could be used against others. It was methodical and brutal, and it usually worked. The interrogation began that afternoon. Hoffman was taken to a room he had never seen before, somewhere in the administrative section of the camp. A table, 2 chairs, and Muller, who sat across from him with patient malevolence. The questions started simply. How long had he worked in the barbershop? What were his duties? Did he ever observe unusual behavior? The questions were designed to establish baseline responses, to understand how Hoffman presented information when he wasn't being accused of anything specific. Then the questions shifted. Had he ever passed information between prisoners? Had he ever smuggled items? Did he know anything about resistance activities? Hoffman answered carefully, denying everything while trying to seem cooperative rather than evasive. He was just a barber. He cut hair. He didn't involve himself in camp politics or prisoner activities beyond his assigned work. Muller listened, making notes, occasionally asking the same question phrased differently to see if Hoffman's answers remained consistent. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. When it finally ended, Hoffman was returned to his barracks, exhausted and terrified. That night, lying on his bunk, Hoffman realized the full scope of the danger. The SS were methodical. They would question dozens, maybe hundreds of prisoners. They would cross-reference testimonies looking for discrepancies and connections. And eventually someone would break. Someone always broke under sufficient pressure. The network needed to cease all activities immediately. No more information sharing, no more smuggling, no more coordination. Complete shutdown until the investigation concluded or moved in another direction. But Hoffman had no way to communicate this to others in the network. He didn't know most of them by name, and those he did know couldn't be contacted without drawing additional suspicion. Over the following week, the investigation intensified. More prisoners were questioned. Rumors spread throughout the camp about beatings and torture. The barbershop remained closed, its operations suspended while the SS conducted their search. Hoffman was interrogated 3 more times. Each session lasted longer than the previous one, the questions becoming more specific, more accusatory. Muller presented minor inconsistencies in Hoffman's answers, pressing him to explain them. Had he said Henri usually cleaned the shop, or that Henri always cleaned it? The difference seemed trivial, but Muller treated it as evidence of deception. On the 8th day of the investigation, Hoffman was taken to the interrogation room to find not just Muller, but 2 other SS officers. This was escalation. They were applying more pressure, using multiple interrogators to break down his defenses. One of the new officers showed Hoffman a list of names. Prisoners who had been seen speaking with Henri in suspicious contexts. Hoffman's name was on the list. So were 15 others. We know something was happening, the officer said. Too many coincidences. Too many prisoners receiving information or items they shouldn't have. Someone was organizing it. Someone was coordinating. He leaned forward, his face inches from Hoffman's. Tell us who. Tell us how it worked. You weren't the leader, we know that. But you were involved. Give us the structure, the names, the methods, and your punishment will be reduced. Hoffman looked at the list of names. Some he recognized as part of the network. Others were probably innocent, just prisoners who happened to interact with Henri in ways that seemed suspicious to investigators looking for patterns. If he confirmed anything, provided any testimony that supported the SS theory of organized resistance, all these people would be executed. Not just the guilty ones but also the innocent ones caught in the investigation's wide net. I don't know what you're talking about, Hoffman said, his voice steady despite the terror that made his hands shake. I cut hair. That's all I've ever done here. The interrogation continued for 6 hours. They beat him, not severely enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to make breathing difficult and thinking harder. They threatened worse torture. They promised leniency if he cooperated. They showed him photographs of other prisoners who had been executed for resistance activities, making clear what would happen if he was found guilty. Hoffman maintained his denials. He focused on a crack in the wall across from him and retreated into himself, finding a place in his mind where the pain and fear couldn't quite reach. He had learned this technique during the early days of the camp, when survival required disconnecting from immediate physical suffering. Now he used it to endure interrogation. When they finally returned him to his barracks, he could barely walk. Other prisoners helped him to his bunk, their faces showing fear. Fear that he might have broken, fear that the investigation would sweep them up next, fear that the quiet resistance they'd all participated in or benefited from was about to be crushed. That night, Hoffman lay in darkness and thought about Henri. About the network. About all the small acts of defiance and resistance that had given prisoners hope and saved lives. The SS wanted to destroy it, to eliminate even the possibility of resistance. And they might succeed. The investigation had momentum now and someone would eventually break. Someone would provide testimony. Someone would crack under pressure that no human being should have to endure. But not yet. Hoffman hadn't broken. And maybe, if he held on long enough, if others held on long enough, the investigation would run out of steam. Maybe the SS would conclude they couldn't prove organized resistance and would settle for punishing a few individuals on lesser charges. Maybe the network could survive in damaged form and eventually rebuild. It was a slim hope. But hope was all Hoffman had left. So he held on to it, despite the pain, despite the fear, despite knowing that tomorrow or the next day he might be taken back to that room and broken beyond his ability to resist. He held on. Because that was what resistance meant. Not grand gestures or dramatic escapes. Just holding on when everything told you to surrender. Just refusing to break. Just maintaining silence when silence might save others. It wasn't heroic. It was simply necessary. And necessary would have to be enough. The investigation continued for 3 more weeks. During that time, Hoffman was interrogated 5 additional times, each session more brutal than the last. The SS had refined their methods, using sleep deprivation, cold, hunger, and calculated violence to break down psychological defenses. Hoffman lost track of days, his world narrowing to the intervals between interrogations and the desperate attempts to recover enough strength to endure the next one. But he didn't break. Neither did Henri. Neither did most of the others on the list. The network structure, its careful avoidance of explicit coordination, its lack of written records, its foundation of deniability, protected them. The SS could suspect, could believe they had discovered organized resistance, but they couldn't prove it with the kind of concrete evidence that their bureaucratic system required. The turning point came in early December. Hoffman was taken to the interrogation room expecting another brutal session. Instead, he found only Muller, who sat at the table looking tired rather than aggressive. The investigation has concluded, Muller said flatly. We have determined that while suspicious activities occurred, we cannot establish sufficient evidence of coordinated resistance to warrant mass executions. He stood, walking to the window that looked out over the camp. Henri and 2 others will be executed tomorrow as examples. They clearly engaged in unauthorized communications, even if we cannot prove the extent of it. The rest of you are being reassigned to different work details. You will never work together again. Hoffman felt relief and horror simultaneously. Henri would die. But the network might survive in some form because its other members would live. The sacrifice seemed both inevitable and unbearable. You were lucky, Muller continued, turning back to face Hoffman. Or perhaps you were telling the truth and you really are just a barber who knew nothing. Either way, you've been transferred to a labor detail in Auschwitz II. You leave tomorrow morning. That night, Hoffman lay on his bunk knowing it was his last night in this barracks, possibly his last night alive. The labor detail in Auschwitz I could be anything from relatively manageable to a death sentence. But more than his own fate, he thought about Henri. The execution happened at dawn. Prisoners were assembled in the central square to witness it. Henri stood on the platform with 2 other prisoners, all 3 maintaining dignity despite the ropes around their necks. When the platform dropped, Hoffman forced himself to watch. Henri deserved that, to be seen in his final moment, to have his death witnessed and remembered. The body hung for hours as a warning. Hoffman stood in formation, his eyes dry despite the grief that felt like it was crushing his chest. He had learned that tears were a luxury in this place. So he simply watched, bearing witness, promising himself that he would remember. Later that day he was processed out of Birkenau and transferred to the main Auschwitz camp. His new assignment was in a factory workshop, manufacturing parts for military equipment. The work was hard but not impossible. His position as a barber was gone, and with it, his access to information and his ability to coordinate help for other prisoners. But the network, damaged though it was, continued to operate. Hoffman learned this gradually over the following months. Other prisoners, new nodes in the web, had stepped into roles that Henri and the executed barbers had filled. The structure had bent under the SS investigation but hadn't entirely broken. Information still flowed. Small items still moved through invisible channels. Help was still provided to prisoners who desperately needed it. Hoffman contributed when he could, though more cautiously now. He passed information he overheard in the workshop. He helped new prisoners understand how to survive. He maintained connections to people who might be part of the network, though these connections were now even more subtle and deniable than before. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was brutal. Hoffman's factory work exposed him to cold that seeped into bones and never quite left. Food rations decreased as the war turned against Germany. Disease spread through the camps, killing prisoners who had survived everything else. Hoffman watched hundreds die, his count long since passing any number he could track. But he survived. His body grew thinner, his health deteriorated, his strength faded. But something inside him, some core of determination or perhaps just stubborn refusal to give the SS a final victory, kept him alive. By spring, rumors began circulating about Allied advances. The whispers were vague and impossible to verify, but prisoners who worked outside the camp brought back fragments of news. The war was turning. Germany was losing. Liberation might possibly, eventually come. Hoffman didn't dare hope too strongly. He had seen too many prisoners break from hope deferred too long. But the rumors gave him something to focus on beyond the immediate suffering, a possibility beyond the endless present. In January 1945, the sounds of distant artillery could sometimes be heard. The SS grew more erratic, their commands more brutal but also more disorganized. Prisoners whispered about evacuation plans, about forced marches westward ahead of advancing Soviet forces. The end was coming, though whether it would bring liberation or death remained uncertain. On January 27, 1945, the guards disappeared. Prisoners woke to find the watchtowers empty, the gates unlocked, the SS fled in the night. For hours no one dared leave, convinced it was a trick, a trap. Then Soviet soldiers appeared and the reality settled slowly, the camp was liberated. Hoffman walked out through gates that had held him prisoner for nearly 3 years. His legs barely supported his weight, and the winter air felt shocking after so long in enclosed spaces. He walked slowly, joined by thousands of other prisoners, all of them moving like ghosts through a landscape that seemed simultaneously real and impossible. He had survived. Against all probability and logic, he had survived. Henri hadn't. The 2 barbers executed with him hadn't. Thousands of others hadn't. But Hoffman had, and now he faced the almost unbearable task of figuring out what to do with that survival. Kraków, Poland. November 1945. Salomon Hoffman stood outside what had once been his barbershop. The building still existed, its stone facade recognizable despite damage from the war. The windows were broken, the door hung crooked on damaged hinges. Inside, he could see debris and evidence of multiple occupants who had used the space without caring for it. He didn't go in. The barbershop he remembered existed only in memory now, and memory was proving to be both precious and painful as he tried to rebuild a life from the wreckage. The months since liberation had been strange, a kind of suspended existence where he was technically free but practically adrift. He had searched for family, finding only absence. His wife had died in the Kraków ghetto. His daughter had been transported to Treblinka. His son had joined the resistance and been executed in 1943. The people who had made his life meaningful were gone, and their absence created a void that felt larger than the physical world around him. Other survivors talked about emigrating, to Palestine, to America, to anywhere that wasn't saturated with European death. Hoffman considered it but ultimately stayed in Kraków. This was his city. These streets held his history. Leaving felt like surrendering the last connection to the life he'd lost. He found work in a hospital, not as a barber but as an orderly. The work was simple, menial, but it gave him purpose. More importantly, it allowed him to be around people who needed help, and helping had become the only thing that gave his survival meaning. At night, lying in the small room he rented, Hoffman would think about the network. About Henri and the executed barbers. About all the small acts of resistance that had seemed so important in the moment but felt impossibly small now when measured against the magnitude of what had been lost. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions of others killed in camps and ghettos. Entire communities erased. The evil had been so vast, so systematic, that any resistance seemed laughable by comparison. What did it matter that he had helped a few dozen prisoners, maybe a few hundred, when millions had died? But slowly, over months and years, a different understanding emerged. He met other survivors, heard their stories, learned about the countless ways people had resisted in large ways and small. Not everyone had been able to fight with weapons. Not everyone had been positioned to sabotage machinery or escape camps. But many had resisted through small acts, sharing food, maintaining culture, helping others survive, preserving humanity in places designed to destroy it. In 1947, Hoffman met Dr. Kowalski again. The doctor had survived and was now practicing in Krakow. They sat in a cafe, two ghosts trying to pretend they were normal people living normal lives. "Do you ever think about what we did?" Kowalski asked. "The package I gave you. The network. All of it." "Every day," Hoffman said. "Did it matter?" Kowalski's question hung in the air between them. "We saved some people. Maybe a few dozen, maybe 100. But millions died. What difference did we really make?" Hoffman thought carefully before answering. "I've been asking myself the same question. And I think the answer is that we'll never know the full impact. The woman who survived because of the medicine you brought, did she later help others? The people who received information that saved them, did they pass on that help? Resistance doesn't always have visible results. Sometimes it just plants seeds that grow in ways we can't track." He paused, looking out the window at the rebuilt street. "But even if we only saved those specific people, even if the ripples went no further, it mattered to them. Each life has infinite value. Saving one person is like saving an entire world. The Talmud teaches that." Kowalski nodded slowly. Henri believed that. He said it once, near the end, before they arrested him. He said that we couldn't save everyone, but we could save someone, and saving someone meant something. They sat in silence for a while, two survivors trying to make sense of survival. In 1952, Hoffman finally returned to barbering. He opened a small shop, nothing like his pre-war establishment but functional. The work felt familiar, his hands remembering movements they had performed thousands of times. But now, every haircut carried different weight. He would think about the prisoners who had sat in his chair at Birkenau, the small moments of connection, the whispered information, the gentle touch on a shoulder. Some days, clients would ask about his time in the camps. He rarely spoke of it. The truth was too heavy to share casually, and most people couldn't understand anyway. How do you explain what it was like to cut hair while people were being murdered a few hundred meters away? How do you describe the psychological weight of small resistance, the constant terror that every action might be your last? But occasionally he would meet another survivor, and they would recognize something in each other's eyes. A shared understanding that needed no words. These meetings became precious to Hoffman, rare moments when he didn't have to pretend that the world made sense or that the past could be overcome through optimism and forward thinking. In 1967, a historian working on an oral history project interviewed Hoffman. The historian asked about resistance in the camps, about the networks that had operated. For the first time, Hoffman spoke in detail about Henri, about the barbershop, about the careful coordination that had saved lives. The historian listened, taking notes. "This is important," he said. "The history of the Holocaust often focuses on either complete victims or dramatic heroes. But what you're describing is something in between, quiet resistance, small acts that accumulated significance. That story needs to be told." Hoffman wasn't sure he agreed. His actions had felt both crucial in the moment and insignificant in retrospect. But he told his story as accurately as he could remember, hoping that someone might find meaning in it. Krakow, Poland. October 1989. Salomon Hoffman was dying. Cancer, the doctor said. It had spread too far for treatment. He had months, maybe less. He was 89 years old, which felt simultaneously ancient and not nearly long enough. In his hospital room he received visitors. Other survivors, mostly the community of ghosts who had built lives from ruins. They spoke about shared memories, about people they'd known, about the strange gift of having survived when so many hadn't. One visitor was a young woman, a granddaughter of someone Hoffman had helped in the camps. She brought a letter written by her grandmother before her death, thanking Hoffman for information he had passed that had allowed her to avoid a selection. "Because of you my grandmother lived," the young woman said. "Which meant my mother was born. Which meant I was born. You didn't just save her life. You saved all the lives that came after." Hoffman took the letter with trembling hands. He had forgotten the specific incident, lost among thousands of haircuts and hundreds of small acts. But this woman's existence proved that those acts had mattered, had rippled forward through time in ways he never could have predicted. After she left, Hoffman lay in his hospital bed thinking about legacy. He had no children of his own, no direct descendants. But perhaps legacy wasn't only biological. Perhaps it was also the lives you touched, the help you offered, the humanity you preserved when preservation seemed impossible. He thought about Henri, executed in December 1943. About the other barbers who had died. About all the prisoners who had participated in the network, who had risked everything to help others. Most of them had died anonymous. Few would be remembered in history books. Their resistance had been too small, too subtle, too easily overlooked when people thought about the war. But it had mattered. Hoffman understood that now with the clarity that sometimes comes near the end. Every life saved had been a victory, however small. Every moment of human connection had been resistance against the machinery of death. Every gentle touch, every whispered piece of information, every small act of care had pushed back against the system that sought to eliminate humanity entirely. The cancer took him on a cold November morning. He died peacefully, surrounded by survivors who had become his chosen family. His last conscious thought was of the barbershop at Birkenau, not the place itself which had been hell, but the moments of connection that had occurred there. The prisoners who had sat in his chair and found for a few minutes, someone who treated them gently. The information that had saved lives. The quiet network that had persisted despite impossible odds. He had been a barber. He had cut hair. And in doing so he had fought back the only way available to him. It hadn't been enough to stop the horror. But it had been something. And something, Hoffman understood in his final moment, was infinitely better than nothing. After Salomon Hoffman's death, a historian researching resistance in Nazi camps discovered his testimony from 1967. The historian spent years tracking down other survivors, piecing together the story of the network that had operated in Birkenau's barbershop. Most of the participants were dead by then, but a few remained, and they confirmed Hoffman's account. The network had saved an estimated 150 to 200 prisoners directly through information, medicine, and small acts of intervention. But the indirect effects, the lives those prisoners then saved, the families they formed after the war, the contributions they made to rebuild societies, extended far beyond any simple calculation. In 1995, a memorial was erected in Kraków to honor quiet resistors, prisoners who had fought back not with weapons but through small acts of courage and compassion. Hoffman's name appears on that memorial, along with Henri's and the others who had participated in the network. The memorial is small, easily overlooked. Few tourists visit it. But survivors sometimes stop there, pausing to remember people who had helped them or people they had tried to help. They stand in silence, bearing witness to a form of resistance that history often forgets. Because the story of the Holocaust is not only about victims and perpetrators. It is also about the people who found ways to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. About the small acts that accumulated significance. About the refusal to surrender humanity in places designed to destroy it. Salomon Hoffman was a barber. He cut hair in the most terrible place imaginable. And by doing so with care, with connection, with quiet courage, he became something more. Not a traditional hero, he would have rejected that label. But a witness to the possibility of goodness even in the heart of evil. A reminder that small acts, repeated consistently, can matter profoundly. His story lingers not because it is dramatic but because it is human. And in the end, preserving humanity was the greatest resistance of all.